Thank you very much. I have a great pleasure introducing Professor Paul-Alain Beaulieu of the Department of Astrology at the University of Toronto. Paul-Alain grew up in Montreal, or took his early education in Université of Montréal in law and history, and obtained his PhD at Yale. Before coming to U of T, he taught at Notre Dame and Harvard. So we are very glad that he was able to find time to speak to us. Paul-Alain's expertise lies in the Mesopotamian history and in all its aspects, and in science, history, linguistics. Today he'll be speaking on the Babylonian Zodiac. As many of you know, most of the zodiac system in practice today is connected with the Babylonian Zodiac, Egyptian, Indian, Chinese. I'm not sure about the Mayan or Aztecs. One of the days he might speak on Maya, Inca, and their zodiac. In many parts of the world, the zodiac system is still in practice. For example, next year is the year of the dragon in Chinese zodiac. And for all you grandparents, make sure that your grandchildren are born next year, not this year. This is year of the ox. Anyway, I have great pleasure in introducing Paul-Alain, and I'll ask him to request him to take over. Thank you very much.
You'll have to unmute yourself, Paul-Alain. Thank you.
Okay, so do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I will not talk about the Indian or Chinese traditions of zodiacal constellations, because this is these are other systems. So I will talk about the Babylonian zodiac, which is basically the origins of the Western zodiac and also the origins of the Islamic zodiac. So this is a specific tradition which has become, of course, very important now, but its origins can be traced to Babylonia. So I'm not a scientist to begin with. I'm not an astronomer. I'm not a mathematician. I'm not a scientist. I'm a cultural historian mostly. I've done some work on ancient Babylonian astronomy and astrology and calendar, some on my own, some in collaboration with other astrologists who actually do specialize on Babylonian astronomy. So to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing, that we're all in sync, I'll begin with some terminology very briefly. First, we have to be familiar with the ecliptic. I'll talk about that, which is the apparent path of the sun, moon, and planets around the Earth. So, of course, in antiquity, the ecliptic and the path of the celestial bodies was assumed to be real because they assumed a geocentric universe. So the Earth was at the center. There were some exceptions to that, like Aristarchus of Samos and Seleucus of Babylon in the Hellenistic period, who advocated, a heliocentric universe. But basically, the path of the sun, moon, and planets around the Earth was assumed to be something real. You see, they were gravitating around the Earth along a very thin band. Now, the second concept is the Zodiacal Belt. So this is the band along the ecliptic, which is 8 to 10 degrees north and 8 to 10 degrees south, in which you can observe a certain number of constellations during the year. And of course, the sun, the moon, and the planets are seen to move across these constellations. And the constellations that we see in that belt are called the zodiacal constellations. So here you have basically a flattened map of the skies with all the areas you see of the 88 constellations that we now recognize. In antiquity, of course, the most important scientist who mapped the constellations was Ptolemy in the 2nd century of our era. He mapped 48 constellations. Of course, we added many more as, especially the Astral, southern constellations were not known at the time, so we added them. And you see here the ecliptic band, you see, which moves through these 12 regions, which are our own signs of the zodiac. And of course, they were pretty much the same at the time of Ptolemy. And as I will discuss shortly, the Babylonians had a very similar map of the ecliptic. So if we continue with the terminology, the term zodiac comes from Latin, it's zodiacus, but which is itself a loan word from Greek, zodiakos kuklos, which means the circle of small animals, you see. So, the zodion in Greek is a diminutive of zoon, animal. So these are the small animals, the circle or the cycle of small animals. And the term zodiac, in fact, reflects simply the prominence of animals among the 12 signs of the zodiac, you see. With a few exceptions, most of them are animals or composite of animals and human beings. So the zodiac, in fact, it's an arbitrary division of the ecliptic into 12 regions of equal size. So we have to think of the ecliptic as a circle of 360 degrees, and it's divided into these 12 equal signs, which are 30 degrees each. Okay. So we see them now as 30 degrees each. In Babylonia, it was a bit more complicated, but we're not entirely certain. So, of course, each of the 12 regions, each of the 12 signs is associated with a specific zodiacal constellations that you can see in that region. You can no longer see it now, but when the system was devised, you could see it. And there are, in fact, more zodiacal constellations than there are zodiacal signs. So when they decided, you see, on the zodiac, they had to leave out some constellations in that ecliptic band that didn't give them names, you see, to specific signs. So now, what about the Babylonian astral sciences? So how did that begin? In fact, we didn't know much about that until, in fact, nothing about that until the 19th century and the decipherment of the cuneiform script. So in the 19th century, you had a flurry of excavations in Iraq. They discovered, tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets, and a number of them are related to astronomy and astrology. Now, the corpus of texts that are relevant date mostly to the 1st millennium BC. This is the time of the Assyrian and Babylonian empires, and after that of the Persian Achaemenid Empire and the Seleucid Greek Empire in the Near East. So most of the texts come from Assyria, 8th and 7th centuries, and Babylonia, 6th to the 1st century BC. And of course, Assyria is mostly northern Iraq, and Babylonia is central and southern Iraq. Now, among this corpus of cuneiform texts that deal with astronomy and astrology, we have various genres of texts that are represented. So we have lists of stars, of constellations. We have detailed records of astronomical and celestial observations. We also have very sophisticated predictive mathematical astronomy, which comes later in the 4th, 3rd, and 2nd century. And also we have this textual corpus, which is quite large, as various strands of tradition that are represented in it. So in other words, we have, in the same corpora of text, you have, various ancient traditions and more recent traditions that coalesce together. And so some are very old, maybe even go back to prehistory, and others are far more recent, like the mathematical astronomy is mostly post-6th century, so Achaemenid and Hellenistic periods. And of course, the words do not necessarily always refer to the same phenomena as you move across genres of text because of these various strands of tradition. So it's a full of pitfalls, when you want to study this corpus. So a few words about the Babylonian astral sciences. we have to realize there's no rigid boundary between astronomy and astrology, you see, in ancient Babylonia. And in fact, there was no such rigid boundary until the Enlightenment in Europe. So people like Copernicus, Kepler, Newton still actually believed in astrology. So for them, there was no contradiction. In fact, the term for astronomer in late Babylonia during the Achaemenid and Hellenistic period is Tupshar Enuma Anu Enlil, means scribe of Enuma Anu Enlil, and Enuma Anu Enlil is a series devoted to celestial divination. So, but these Tupshar Enuma Anu Enlil are the ones who recorded the observations and devised all the functions to predict phenomena. So they were scientists at the same time. So Babylonian astronomy is essentially predictive. So that's their interest. So, and its development was very probably linked to the need for forecasting phenomena for the purpose of divination. So for example, the length of months, lunar and solar eclipses, these were their major interests in forecasting because these were important for divination. And this is in sharp contrast to Greek astronomy, which actually was not interested originally so much in forecasting phenomena, but they were interested in explaining the universe as with geometric models. Okay. Now in the text that we have from Babylonia, there's no genre devoted to cosmology. So there's no explanation of the structure of the universe. So they don't talk about that. I mean, they may have talked about that in private, but they didn't write it down. So their interest is essentially mathematical and predictive. You see, when they develop their science. So now what about the Babylonian constellations? So that's a very complicated subject. They're not all that well known, you know, except by name, and except those along the ecliptic. So along the ecliptic band, the constellations are fairly well known. We're in fairly secure ground, but when we leave that, you know, it becomes fuzzier. So we have no Babylonian equivalent to the star catalog of Ptolemy, for example, you know, from the 2nd century, which describes, you know, all 48 constellations and lists the stars that belong to them with coordinates. So we don't have that in Babylonia, but we have from Babylonia various texts and textual genres which give us fractional information on names of stars, of constellations, location in the sky, how they were imagined, the gods they were associated with, and so on. So these strands of information are like a puzzle with 1,000 pieces, but we only have like 300 pieces of the puzzle, you see, and some pieces should fit, but they don't. So it's not all that easy to deal with this corpus. Also, another pitfall is that, of course, the Greek zodiacal constellations were largely borrowed from the Babylonian constellations. So because they have the same names, okay, and the same location in the sky, but it doesn't mean that they were identical. So because, of course, the Greeks borrowed, but then they reshaped the constellations and they associated them with their own mythology. So physically, the constellations are not necessarily the same. So, and we know that because we have enough descriptions of constellations to realize that sometimes the Babylonian, you know, add more stars to our constellations, the Greeks fewer, and so on. So it's not another pitfall of the corpus. So the basic starting point, you know, of Babylonian the study of Babylonian constellations is a text which is called Mul Apin, which means plow star. Mul Apin is Sumerian. So Mul means star, Apin means plow. So the first tablet here that you see is a large tablet of the series Mul Apin. It's a series in 2 tablets. This one is nearly complete. It's in the British Museum. And it's a manuscript from Babylonia, probably from the 6th century, the Neo-Babylonian period. So the time of Nebuchadnezzar the Great. But the date of composition of the series Mul Apin is very probably late 2nd millennium, between 1100 and 1000 BC. Okay, this we know because of the the celestial coordinates that they give. You see in the in the series Mulapian. So now it's a very long text, but the Mulapian does talk about the zodiacal belt, you see, and it lists all those constellations which you can see along the ecliptic. And they call it as such, this is translation, the stars that stand in the path of the moon, that's the ecliptic, through whose region the moon during a month passes repeatedly and keeps touching them. First, the stars, Pleiades, the bull of heaven, that's our Taurus, the true shepherd of Anu, that's Orion, then the old man, the crook, the great twins, that's Gemini, the crab, that's Cancer, the lion, that's Leo, the furrow, that's Virgo, the scales, that's Libra, the scorpion, that's Scorpio, Pabilsag, that's Sagittarius, the goatfish, that's Capricorn, the great one, that's Aquarius, the tails, that's Pisces. Another part of Pisces is the swallow. Another part of Pisces is Anunitu, that's a goddess. And finally, Aries is called the Iron Man. So they list the 12 constellations, you see, that became zodiacal signs. And you can see already that most of them actually are identical in name, you see, with the Greek constellations and with our own constellations, which are derived from the Greeks. So it lists, 18 or 16 constellations along the ecliptic. And in fact, the two fish of Pisces and the tails, their tails, may still have been considered separate constellations. So we have 3 into 1 later. So, also, Mulapian at the end of the text states explicitly that it's not only the moon that travels there, but it's also the sun and the planets. So the moon, the sun, and the planets were seen as traveling celestial bodies, you see, along a background of fixed stars, which made up the constellations. So in total, Mulapian lists 71 constellations and individual stars visible in ancient Iraq. Of course, they're still in the northern hemisphere. It names them, associates them with specific deities, and many constellations, or most of them, had two aspects. One mythological, in the form of an animal, an object, or supernatural being, and also a theological aspect because of the association with gods. This is not very different from what you have later in Greece, where you had individuals writing about the constellations and telling myths about them and their shape and associating them with specific gods. So when was this zodiac invented, in fact? The zodiac being, of course, the arbitrary division of the ecliptic into 12 equal regions. It's almost certain that it was invented at some point during the 5th century BC. So this is the time of the glory of Athens, you see, with Pericles, you see, and all these, this great cultural moment. So in the 5th century, Babylonia was no longer an independent nation, an independent country. It was part of the Persian Achaemenid Empire. So now we have the earliest pieces of evidence we have for the introduction of the zodiac comes from a body of very important texts called the Astronomical Diaries, which are daily records of celestial observations with some meteorological observations. And the diaries for the years minus 453, 440, and 418 contain references to the positions of planets in zodiacal signs rather than in zodiacal constellations. So I'm giving here a quote from the diary for the year minus 453, which is in fact 454 BC. On the 28th day of the month, Mercury's last appearance in the east was at the end of Aquarius, so which is called the Great One. So, now we have diaries earlier than that, with one from the 7th, one from the 6th, one or two from the 6th century. And in these diaries, the planets are said to be behind or after a zodiacal constellation. They're not said to be in it, you see, or at the end of it. So which indicates that there was a change in the 5th century towards locating these planets in regions that have names of constellations. So, which indicates that the signs were invented already. And we have the two earliest known Babylonian horoscopes, which are dated to the year 410 BC. They also mention zodiacal signs rather than constellations, obviously. I mean, from the context. So by the end of the 5th century, nobody doubts that the zodiac had been invented, you see, as a division of the ecliptic band. So now, why did they invent the zodiac? That's another question. That's a cultural question. First, of course, they like to systematize their knowledge, in very simple schemes. So they didn't do science the way we do science now, needless to say. For example, they had a luni-solar calendar with intercalation. So they basically had a solar calendar of 12 months of 30 days each, ideal. So, lunar calendar. But of course, they knew it didn't work. It was never in sync with the solar year. So every 3 or 4 years, they had to put an additional month, an intercalary month. Okay. And in the Babylonian epic of creation, composed at about the same time as Mul-Apin, the god Marduk, who creates the world, you see, and organizes everything, he assigns, it's clearly said that he assigns roles to the celestial bodies and determines that the month will be 30 days each. So in other words, it's a very simple scheme. So 12 months, 360 days, 12 months of 30 days each. And of course, the zodiac conformed to the notion of an ideal year of 360 days with 12 months of 30 days because they could divide it in 360 degrees, you see, and then they divided the 360 degrees in 12 regions of 30 days. So it's by analogy, very probably, with the lunar calendar that they did that. They knew it didn't work. You see that it's not in sync, but that was not important for them. What is important is to devise a simple system and work the exceptions, from that once you have a system. And we should keep in mind that the Babylonians had a sexagesimal system, which they use only for science. So it's a system, it's a numerical system with a base 60, not a base 10 as we do. Okay, so that's why, in fact, we inherited that system, because that's why a circle has 360 degrees. That's the Babylonians who devised that first. Now we'll look now at these 12 signs of the zodiac, that were invented. So here in red, you have the Latin names, the English translations of these names. And in yellow, you have the names in Babylonian. Okay, and here the translations of these names. So you can see that most of them are more or less the same. The Gemini is the great twins in Babylonian. Cancer is the crab. Leo is the lion, which is written as the big dog, but that's because they saw them as related. But some are different. But the differences are actually not what they appear to be. So the great one is actually a human figure pouring water. But he's a big figure, so he's the water bearer. And there, where you have more complicated differences is, with Virgo, it's called the furrow. But that's because they saw the furrow as, a female figure, probably a goddess, holding an ear of grain. And that's, of course, there's an agricultural association. And that eventually became the maiden, you see, in the Greek imagination. The more difficult one is the hired laborer, who became the ram, and I will talk about that later during the talk. So I talked about the Babylonian language. We should not also forget that it was a bilingual culture. They used Sumerian and Babylonian, you see, in their textual corpus. Now, Sumerian was a dead language by then. It died out at the beginning of the 2nd millennium BC, but that was the original language of southern Iraq. So, and later on, it was replaced by Akkadian, which is a Semitic language, and Babylonian is the southern dialect of Akkadian. But this Sumerian and Akkadian bilingualism remained ingrained in the textual corpus. So they use Sumerian a little bit like we use Latin, until the 18th century, or still even today sometimes. So these are the names of the constellations in Sumerian, the Babylonian or Akkadian names, if you want, and the translations. So Mul, Luhunga is Agru, the hired laborer, and so on. So you see that you always have Mul at the beginning. Mul means star in Sumerian. It also means constellation. So now they invented the zodiac, but that doesn't, just saying that doesn't tell us exactly what kind of zodiac they have. Because you have two types of zodiac, basically. One which is tied essentially to the stars. Okay, so that's called the sidereal zodiac. And the other one is tied to the calendar and the solar year. That's the tropical zodiac. That's our zodiac. Okay, so to have a zodiac tied, to have a tropical zodiac, in fact, you need to have a solar calendar. But the Babylonians didn't have a solar calendar. They had a lunar calendar with intercalations. Okay, so that's called a lunisolar calendar. And this is why they created a sidereal zodiac, because of course the zodiac needs to be a permanent system of coordinates. Okay, so if you have a lunisolar year, you cannot have a tropical zodiac. So I mean, this will become more obvious as I go on. So it's essentially a sidereal. So the Babylonian was lunisolar, but with intercalations, because they knew, they realized that in the 6th century that 235 lunar months is more or less 19 solar years by 2 hours, you see, of difference. So they had a system to intercalate months. But of course, their calendar was not always in sync with the solar cycle. So what happened is that at the time of its adoption, its creation in Babylonia, this sidereal zodiac was in general.
Sorry, you just somehow muted yourself, Paul-Alain.
Am I unmuted? Yeah, I probably clicked something. So anyway, okay, so when the zodiac was introduced, the sidereal zodiac was in general agreement with the tropical year. Okay, in other words, the beginning of the year corresponded with the entrance of the sun in Aries, okay, in the ram. So, and that's where the vernal equinox occurred. And that was probably the star Beta Arietis nowadays, although there's some discussion as to the exact degree. But when the Greeks and eventually the Romans borrowed the zodiac, they tied it to the solar calendar, because from the 1st century BC on, you see the calendar of the Roman Empire was solar. So that's the Julian calendar. So, and what happened is that because of precession, because of the precession of the equinoxes, the constellations which gave their names to zodiacal signs are now in the next sign of the zodiac. So for example, the constellation Aries, the constellation of the ram, is now seen in the sign Taurus. Okay, that's because of the precession of the equinoxes. So for those who don't know what precession is, so I've plundered this image from the Encyclopedia Britannica. Basically, you have to think of the Earth as a top. You see, when you spin a top, so it's upright, for a few seconds, then it starts to wobble. And the Earth is like a top that has been sent around the sun, a very long time ago, and wobbles permanently along its axis. Okay, so the axis of the Earth, you see, is not perpendicular to the celestial axis, so it's inclined. Okay, so the Earth spins around its axis, but not in the same plane as the sun. and it wobbles. But the wobble is very long. It wobbles over a period of almost 26,000 years. The more exact figure is 25,800 years. What does that mean, in terms of observing the star? Is that, of course, the stars will not always be in the same position. They will come back in the same position after a full cycle of 25,800 years. Okay. So the Babylonians had started to realize that, that there was a discrepancy because of the accumulated data they had for centuries. But the first one who identified the issue was Hipparchus. You see, the Greek astronomer who lived in the 2nd century BC. But the fully developed theory had to wait for Newton to explain exactly why and how we have precession. So what happens with precession is that, for example, we have, you see, the beginning, in Babylonia, the spring began with the vernal equinox. That's when the celestial equator intersects with the ecliptic. Okay, that's the beginning of the year, of the solar year in ancient times. So now what happens is that because of precession, you see the constellations you see during the vernal equinox, you see, are receding backwards. So that's now, it's no longer in Aries, now it's in Pisces. Okay, it recedes backwards. And now the constellation Aries is no longer in the sign Aries, it's in the sign Taurus. Why? It's because the Romans, the Greek and the Romans eventually adopted the tropical zodiac, which fixed the zodiac permanently in terms of calendar. But because of precession, of course, the constellation that gave its name to the zodiac, to the zodiacal sign, is receding in the sky. Okay, so this is a basic problem of the ancient astronomy. So how did they use the zodiac in Babylonia? For two purposes. One is for purely astronomical research. So for example, in the astronomical diaries, they calculate the daily positions of the moon, sun, and planets, eclipses and everything else and other phenomena. They even, record Halley's Comet twice, in the Hellenistic period. So they use the zodiac to record these positions of the celestial bodies using degrees within the signs. You see, so each sign has 30 degrees. So, and then they observe Jupiter. Well, it's in the degree 17 of Taurus now, for example. So, and they will enter that in their diaries. Second, it's for astrology, because with the introduction of zodiac, you also have the rise of the horoscopes, which are personal. You see, predictions tied to the position of the celestial bodies at birth, which are tied to one person. Because before that, until the 5th century, astrology was essentially a state affair. It was a public affair. So, the predictions you could draw from eclipses and other phenomena concerned the welfare of the king and the welfare of the state. But starting with the adoption of the zodiac, then you have personal astrology. So you're centered now more on the individual. So now I talked about the Babylonian origin of zodiacal constellations. So most of them, of course, most of the Greek and our constellations were borrowed from Babylonia. And during the Hellenistic period, when the world was unified, you see, eventually even by the Romans, all these things traveled, outside Babylonia to the Hellenistic world, to Egypt, to Rome, to Western Europe, and so on. And we see that in Egypt, you see there's a famous temple called the Temple of the Goddess Hathor at Dendera in Upper Egypt in the south, where we have a complete map of the heavens, you see, with pictures of the zodiacal constellations, and we see the Babylonian constellations there being borrowed even in Egypt. So it's a common culture which emerges, which we eventually inherited in the West. So I'll give you just one example of what how a Babylonian constellation evolved in terms of imagination. So this is Capricorn. Of course, Capricorn is a goat, but it's also a goldfish. In fact. So in the Western tradition, it's represented in both ways. So this comes from Babylonia. It's a very old concept, which is Sumerian. In Sumerian, a suhur is a carp, kuradu in Babylonian. And this small ku, number 6, you see, is a determinative for fish. So the suhur fish. Then mash, here this means the sign mash number 2 is a goat, uritsu in Akkadian. So in Sumerian, you have the suhur mash, ku 6, which is the goldfish. And it's borrowed in Babylonian as suhur mashu. So that means the goldfish. So this is a very old figure, which is attested since the late 3rd millennium BC in art. So we have representations of that. And since the early 2nd millennium BC in texts. And later in the 2nd millennium, around the time of Mulapin, composition of Mulapin, it becomes quite popular. So for example, we have a goldfish representation here. This is a stone, carved stone with an inscription and figurative monuments. It's a land grant of a Babylonian king called Milishipak, who reigned at the end of the 2nd millennium. It's preserved in the Louvre. And on the top registers, you see symbols of gods. So this is the god Anu with his tiara, the god Enlil with his tiara, and this is the third most important god, Ea or Enki. He has 2 names, and his symbol is the head of a ram on top of an altar, and he has his emblematic animal with him, and this is, of course, you recognize the goatfish, the Capricorn. You see, it's very obvious that this is a goat, and the back is a fish. The series Molapin was composed not too long after that, and the Sohor Mashu is already one of the zodiacal constellations. So originally, of course, this word meant it was a real fish because we still have a fish called the goldfish. That's the mullet, because they have barbs. You see, on their under their mouth, and later on it became a composite being. What astrologists call mishvesen after the term, to a mixed being. So by the late 2nd millennium, the goldfish had become mythologized and was associated with the god Ea or Enki, the god of subterranean waters, and eventually the goldfish became a constellation, a zodiacal constellation. So they saw a goldfish in the sky. Now, why? Who knows? So these things are always quite arbitrary. So we have goldfish representations from the period of the composition of Mulapin. This is from Susa in southwestern Iran. So we're already outside Mesopotamia. And you have very clear representations of goldfish in this cultic basin found at Susa and now in the Louvre. Of course, it's a cultic, everything associated with water could have, goldfish, because of course it's an aquatic animal. And we have another goldfish representation here from the 1st century BC or 1st century AD, when this temple in Dendera in Upper Egypt was created. You see a very obvious representation of the goldfish. It's not Egyptian, it's clearly Babylonian, but it's set within an Egyptian context, you see. So the rest of the iconography is clearly Egyptian, but this is clearly not Egyptian. It's a very Babylonian figure. So it shows you, with this example, you see the diffusion of this Babylonian imagery you see throughout the ancient world. But it reached even Rome, because the Emperor Augustus was a great devotee of the sign Capricorn. So this is a famous ancient jewel, which is called the Gemma Augusta, which you can see in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. This is the triumph of the Emperor Augustus, with laurels, even his apotheosis. And you see above him the sign Capricorn in a small lunar circle. And in fact, Augustus loved that sign, and he claimed that it was his own zodiacal sign, but it was not, in fact, because he was born in September. We know his date of birth, and there were discussions in ancient times as to his claim, for, having Capricorn as a sign, but it was the time of his conception, assumed conception, in late December 64, in the year 64 BC. So we see there are many representations of Capricorn on coins associated with Augustus. So you see one very obvious here, very beautiful representation. It says Signis Receptis. This is the capture of the standard, from the Parthians. And it's associated with, of course, it was a big event of the reign of Augustus. And you can see his, this, figure of Capricorn. So we don't know exactly why he loves Capricorn so much. There might be some reason that we cannot imagine, but it's a fact. So you can see the travels of this Babylonian motif, all the way to Rome, in fact. So now there's another interesting case. I mentioned that earlier, that the Aries, which is the ram for us, or the sheep, was called the hired laborer in the Babylonian Zodiac. Now, this is a very complicated issue of interaction between the Greeks and the Babylonians. Now, this is a bit complicated because, of course, the Babylonians, they had a complex writing system, and they like to play with it a great deal. They love puns. So I told you in Sumerian, the hired laborer is the mul, that's star, Lu, number 2, Hun Ga. So that's Agru, the hired laborer. Now in Sumerian, the sign Lu, number 2, means man. So it's a determinative before names of professions. Okay. Hun is the verb to hire, Agaru. And a Hunga, that's a participle or an adjective, is a hireling, an Agru. Okay. So the Lutu Hunga is the Agru, the hired laborer. Now we have, as a matter of fact, the sheep, in Babylonian, Imiru, is equivalent to Udu in Sumerian. But the sign Udu has the phonetic value Lu in the cuneiform writing system. And this is the value we call Lu number 1, whereas this one is called Lu number 2. But they were pronounced the same. We give them numbers just to differentiate them. So therefore, Lu number 2 can become Lu number 1 by phonetic association, by wordplay, and thus the hired laborer, Lu tu Hunga, can become a hired sheep or a ram. So Lu Udu Hunga, and simply a sheep. So the short name of the constellation, in fact, becomes Mul Lu number 1, or Mul Udu. So in other words, there was a justification by play on words to change the name of that constellation. Okay. Now, this actually was discussed, you see, since the beginning of the 20th century, you see, by specialists of Babylonian astronomy, but it's been confirmed glaringly, you see, by a discovery which I made actually in the Yale Babylonian collection, where I worked for many years, you see, as research scholar. So it's a portion of a very large tablet from the Hellenistic period, which describes constellations, you see, in order, by their order of appearance in the sky, most at the beginning along the ecliptic. So, so the text, the purpose of the text has been to enable people to draw constellations, and put some stars in the right place, to have the right figure. At any rate, so I discovered it in the 1990s. It was published only 2 years ago, in 2018, in collaboration with a couple of other astrologists. And the text is dated to the year 214 BC. So it's dated by the Seleucid era, and in the Julian calendar date is January 4, 2014 BC. This is an image of this tablet, which was very difficult to read, that to be pieced together, from fragments and cleaned. And then, I realized, well, this is, a list of constellations and what they look like. So I will, the beginning of the text here, you see the first square, it's 3 columns on each side. The first column here, you have the first portion, that's the beginning of the year. In other words, the constellations which are around the vernal equinox. Okay, and lines 12 to 16 describe Aries. So what does it say? It says the constellation which stands after it, after Pisces, which are called the tails, is the hired laborer, the hired sheep. Month of Nisanu, that's the first month of the year. The month of the god Anu. It is the constellation of the beginning of the year. So that's the vernal equinox. The constellation, the hired laborer, is a lamb. It is a sheep. The god Dumuzi, that's of course normal association with gods. Concerning the hired sheep, 3 stars are drawn in its head, 2 stars are drawn in its tail, and 4 stars stand at its feet. So it's somewhat different from the Ptolemaic description of that constellation, but the 3 stars on the head are the 3 stars which are the most characteristic of Aries, you see. So you see that there's a very close relation between the Greek and the Babylonian constellation. So what do we have in this text is that they explain, it's a commentary, explaining how the hired laborer became the hired sheep. So it's an explanation, which is not often you have that in Babylonian text, but it was deemed important enough for them to comment on it. Now, when did that happen? So that's the other question. We have astronomical diary for the year 385 BC. Okay, so that's before the Hellenistic period. No, it's still part of the Achaemenid Empire. And there the constellation is called Lu number 1, which is of course Udu, sheep. So the zodiacal sign has already become Lu or Lu number 1 or Udu. So it's already a sheep. But this is quite early and seems to preclude Greek influence. But this remains open because you already had Greek influence in the Achaemenid Empire. So when maybe the Babylonians were in contact already with the Greeks, and they may have decided already to, make their own constellations agree completely with the Greek constellations, which of course had been borrowed mostly from Babylonia. But we know very little about Greek constellations between the 3rd century BC. So a couple of them are mentioned in Homer and Hesiod, but surprisingly, we don't know much about them before the Hellenistic period, at the time when they had already borrowed a lot of Babylonian material. So we don't know, this back and forth exchange, you see, is a bit uncertain. We also have seal impressions on cuneiform tablets from the Seleucid period at Uruk, which was one of the big centers of astronomical knowledge. That big tablet comes from Uruk. And they frequently depict zodiacal signs. And all the signs are represented, but there's no single figure that can be identified as a hired laborer. But a sheep depiction occurs quite often. And the earliest one is from the year 292 BC. So it had already been, decided that, in fact, this hired laborer was, in fact, a sheep. So just to show you how complicated, all this material can become, especially when you deal with fragmentary information. That's another text which I discovered in the Yale Babylonian collection, in which I published with Francesca Rochberg, who's actually a specialist of Babylonian astronomy. She does only that. She's very well known, teaches at the University of California at Berkeley in the Near Eastern department. So we published that in 1996. So it's a small tablet in the Yale University Babylonian collection. And, I realized it had importance, when I picked it up. And I showed it to Francesca, and she identified it as a horoscope. She actually published a book on Babylonian horoscopes, later, in 1998. So where she collects, the 50 or so known Babylonian horoscopes. So it's the horoscope of a man called Anu Belshunu. He's from Uruk also, so we're still in that very important southern city. Um, and this Anu Belshunu actually, he may be identical with an astronomer from Uruk who belonged to a very important family called the descendants of Silniki Unini. And he appears, as the author or copier of astronomical and astrological texts, which span from the years 118 to 124 of the Seleucid era. Therefore, if we go after the date of his birth here, he was between the age of 55 and 61 when he authored these texts. So we're not sure that it's the same Anu Belshunu, but it may well be. So, because usually horoscopes were cast for people of some significance because you needed money to pay people to do these things. So that's the translation of this horoscope. So year 63, that's the Seleucid era, of course, which begins in 311 BC. Month Tebetu, that's the 10th month of the Babylonian calendar. Evening, day 2, Anu Belshunu was born. That day, the sun was 9.5 degrees in Capricorn. Remember, I told you this is a sexagesimal system. So this is the first fraction here. So 30 on 60 is 1/2. So 9.5 degrees in Capricorn. The moon was 12 degrees in Aquarius. His days will be long. That means he will have a long life, which he did if it's the same Anu Belshunu that we know. Jupiter was at the beginning of Scorpius. Someone will help the prince. That's another prediction. The child, here it's partly broken, was born in Aquarius within the region of Venus. This is very uncertain. He will have children or sons. That's the same meaning. So Mercury was in Capricorn, Saturn was in Capricorn, Mars was in Cancer. So now this is unlikely to have been cast at the time of his birth. This is probably, it's not observational astronomy. It's been recalculated probably later. You see by, a specialist, in Uruk who cast the horoscope for Anu Belshunu, maybe, when he was 40 years old, 50 years old, who knows? So it's based on calculations, not on observations. And if we look at the astronomical data of the horoscope, so this is what the text tells us about the positions. And this is the computed data, modern computation of the data for 249 BC, December 29, 7 p.m., which is what the horoscope says. So there may be some margin of error, but very little. And if we compare the data, we realize that the Babylonians were quite accurate. Remember, they don't do science like the way we do science. They didn't have all the instruments we have. So 9.5 degree in Capricorn for the sun. In fact, the sun was in 12 degree Capricorn. Okay. The moon was 12 degree in Aquarius. According to the tablet, well, it's 15 degree according to computations. Jupiter, beginning of Scorpius, was 12 degrees in Scorpius. So they may have estimated it earlier. Beginning, it's the first 6 or 7 degrees. Venus was in Aquarius. Yes, it was 13 degrees in Aquarius. Mercury was in Capricorn. Yes, 25 degrees. Saturn was in Capricorn. Yes, 10 degrees. And Mars was in Cancer. Yes, 3 degrees. So they were quite accurate, you see, with their computation. Again, this is extremely unlikely this was observed. This was recalculated later. They had tables and data going back centuries. So they knew how to compute these things. The only problem with that is, where is the degree 0? So where does the zodiac begin? So see, again, it's a sidereal zodiac. So you need a point in the sky where it begins. Now there have been very long discussions of that, because we have several genres of text which put, in one genre of text, you will put the vernal equinox like in 8 degrees of Aquarius, not of Aquarius, of Aries. In others, you put it in 3 degrees, you see, and depending on when these things were devised. So we generally think now that the degree zero of, and in fact, this can be determined by adding all the observational data, which they did, and then it gives us more or less where they started the computation of the sidereal zodiac, and it's very probably just at the beginning of Aries. This is Aries. You see the three stars that characterize it, and this is Pisces, and it's very probably in between, just at the beginning of Aries. Okay, so and I will now give. I don't know how much time I have. Okay, so I'll finish with the. I'm just giving you examples, you see, of all this, because you could go on. You could go on for hours talking about all this stuff. There's another very important aspect of the zodiac during that period, which is medical astrology. We know that in ancient times and until the Renaissance, astrology was used in medicine. And the Babylonians started this. So the development of medical astrology is very largely linked to the zodiac. Starting in the 5th century, and we have texts associating zodiacal signs with parts of the body. That was very common in the Middle Ages in Europe as well as in the Islamic world. You see, what is called Iatro Mathematica. You see the association of, of the cosmos with, organs and parts of the body. So the principle of the zodiacal man, that, each person, reproduces, in fact, or corresponds to the cosmos. So it's a principle of universal cosmic sympathy. So what one principle they introduced that was very important in medical astrology is something else that the Greeks inherited eventually, is the dodecametaria, which we call the Microzodiac, which is a subdivision of each sign into 12 parts of 2.5 degrees each. So each sign is 30 degrees, and then you subdivide it into 12 more parts, 12 miniature zodiacal signs, which have 2.5 degrees each, for a total of 30 degrees for the sign. Thus, each sign became a smaller zodiac. So it's a zodiac within a zodiac. So each sign of the zodiac contains another zodiac. Now, this has nothing to do with astronomy or observation. It's simply a speculation. And so the larger zodiac became divided into 144 parts. But this gave rise to numerous speculations. Again, they liked to systematize knowledge, even if it didn't make sense from the observational point of view. But they like to work with these things. So they did real science, but also they did all this, speculative, science, knowledge on the side. So, and gave rise to numerous speculations, especially for medical astrologies, which remedies to administer when, at which time of the year, which day, and so on. So salves, poultices, ritual, and so on. So there are many texts, devoted to that. There's even a doctoral dissertation that was written at Brown University a few years ago on the Microzodiac, and all its associations. So I'll give you one example. This is a text from Uruk, again, which was discovered by the German excavations at Uruk in the 1970s and was published. And this text is devoted to the 4th month of the year, which is called Duzu. So after the god Dumuzi. So the 4th month of the year, and it has 30 lines. So one line for each day. Again, months are ideally 30 days long, in their system. And in fact, it's part of a system which probably had one such tablet for each day of the month. But only month 4 and month 8 were discovered in this library, in a house at Uruk, Cuneiform Library, which actually had, belonged to a family that was interested in astronomy and astrology. So, and it associates each day with a degree in a zodiacal sign, and it prescribes ideal ingredients for medical purpose. You know, so they call it anointing. Um, so I will just show you. I think instead of reading this, I'll show you just the translation of the first 12 lines. Okay, so there are 30 lines, you know, one for each day. So this is month four, and ditto, ditto, ditto. So it's all month four. There you have which day. It goes from 1 to 30. I give you only the first 12 days. And then you have in succession the 12 signs of the zodiac, but they're not in their sidereal order. You see there, they appear to be listed at random. And then after that, you have a number, which is a degree in the sign. Okay. Now, so Aries, each of these positions, this has nothing to do with observational astronomy. It's all a numerical speculation. Each of the sign each of the degrees in a sign is separated from the following one by 277 degrees, you see, on the circle, you see, on the ecliptic circle. So between each position, you have 277 degrees. So you go around like this. So this is in fact an application of this microzodiac, because you see that you list 12 days. Each one is associated with one of the 12 signs, okay, and a position in the 12 signs. Now, in this group of 12, no single day shares the same sign. Okay. Then on the 13th day, you begin again, you know, starting 277 degrees from this position, and then you go down the 12 signs again with the days, okay? And it's organized so that the 360 days of the ideal year all have a position in the zodiac which is specific to them. So no single position is ever repeated. So they had a mathematical function to do that. You see, so it's a numerical speculation. So it seems crazy, of course, but you know these systems actually traveled to Greece and Rome, and then to the West to see in medieval time. What is interesting are the ingredients that are given here. So for the sign Aries, you have sheep blood, sheep fat, and sheep hair, and you anoint. These are directives given in the second person. So you use that. So that's for medical purposes, And of course, the fact that sheep ingredients are associated with Aries indicates again that the sign had become a sheep. So in fact, most of these prescriptions, are related to the sign itself, in various ways. For Capricorn, it's goat blood, goat fat, and goat hair, and you anoint. For Libra, when I say empty place, is because this tablet is copied from another tablet. And either there was a break on the tablet or there was nothing on the tablet. So he doesn't know. You anoint. Cancer, crab blood, crab fat. You anoint. Taurus, bull blood, bull fat, bull hair. You anoint. Aquarius, eagle head, wing, and blood. Why? It's because Aquarius was next to a small constellation called the Eagle. So you have an association. Scorpio, again, empty place. Leo, lion blood, lion fat, lion hair, you anoint. Gemini, rooster head, blood, and wing. Again, Gemini was near a small constellation called the rooster. So of course you can have that the blood of twins. So unless you commit murder, so you just pick a rooster instead. Pisces, you have dove head, blood, swallow head, blood. I didn't talk about Pisces, but in Babylonia, Pisces, one of the two fishes was actually a dove, and the other one was a fish. So that's why you have dove head and blood, and so on. So Sagittarius, again, it's a mythical being, so you cannot have blood. So it's unclear what goes on here, but it's probably another association with the constellations. And Virgo, you have barley flour, Well, that's because Virgo in Babylonia, that's a maiden holding an ear of grain, so it's barley flour. And raven head and raven wing, it's because there's a small constellation near Virgo, which is the raven. So this is how they speculated, you see, about, with the zodiac, you see, and all these things. So, this is a list of all these ingredients, you see, and so sheep, bull, rooster, crab, lion, and so on. So in this tablet. And now that's the last slide. So this is a reconstruction of the Babylonian map of heavens with the imaginary constellations. This is to a speculative. You see, it's to a degree. It's been made by it's based on a book in Russian, in fact, which is the first book in a long time. It was published a few years ago to describe the Babylonian constellations. You see, this is the book. You can see it. So this is based on that book, and you see all these constellations here. I don't know if you can. Laser point tool. So you see here you have the great one, that's Aquarius. Then you move here, that's Pisces. You see one is a dove, the other one is a fish. That's the ram, Aries, Taurus, Gemini, the great twins, Cancer, the crab, the lion. Here you have Virgo. You see this goddess holding an ear of grain. And then you move in Libra and Scorpion, Scorpio. And finally, you move to Sagittarius, which is Pabil Sag. Pabil Sag is actually the name of a god. There's the god Pabil Sag, who's depicted as a centaur, shooting arrows. So, and with the tail of the scorpion sometimes. So clearly, again, it's a Babylonian association. And here you have, the goldfish, Capricorn. As you move out of the ecliptic, it becomes more and more uncertain. Although some of them, are also fairly well known, like the serpent Hydra. Here you have Raven. That's why Raven is associated with Virgo. I told you that for the great twins you use rooster blood. Well, this is the rooster here. That's outside the ecliptic. Okay, so I think I'll end here before you collapse.